Well, good morning. Welcome to our In the Word podcast, our first one of February. We are so glad that you've chosen to join with us this morning. At this point, we're over a month into our journey through the Word of God. This journey is going to take us all the way through the 12 months of this year as we walk through the entirety of God's Word. That's our goal, is by December to be able to look back and say, man, we've read through the entirety of Scripture and seen all that God is doing and have a kind of a bigger picture of what God is saying there. So this week we started book number 3 for us anyway. It's the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, but it'll be our third book that we've walked through. And man, there's a lot of stuff in the book of Exodus. Just kind of recapping. Things have changed quite a bit from where we left off at the end of the book of Genesis. Just kind of recapping a little bit. If you remember, there at the book of Exodus picks up about 400 years after the end of the book of Genesis. And kind of after that conclusion, if you remember at the end of the book of Genesis, we had 70 people from Jacob's family coming down to Egypt to dwell there and to live there during the famine. And fast forward 400 years, and that 70 people, as some historians believe, become about 2 to 3 million people. And it's really kind of just this fulfillment of what Genesis 1:28 talks about. There in Genesis 1:28, where God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And we get a very similar expression there in Exodus 1 verse 7, where it says, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them." So we get kind of this picture that, God's people are flourishing, they're growing, they're expanding. And then everything kind of changes with verse 9, or verse 8 in Exodus chapter 1. Because Exodus chapter 1 verse 8 says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And really from that point we see that the people become enslaved, and they're crying out to God for help. And really kind of the initial question there at the beginning of the book of Exodus is, will God hear and answer their prayers? And so that's kind of leading us into what we're going to be talking about today. And that's what we always do. Each week we're going to share just different thoughts and insights on things as we've been reading. At this point I think we've read from Exodus 1 probably up through Exodus 20, 22, something like that. And so we're just going to share some different highlights and thoughts that we've had as we've been reading this week. And so, Byron, you usually go first?
Sure.
All
Well,
right.
this is one of I would say this is probably my favorite book in the Bible, simply because I think early on as a child, this was the first book that I actually got to see realized through film and just television. Immediately when I think of this, it's synonymous with Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments, that great epic movie that continues to still get played and aired every year right on the brink of Easter. And did such a good job of just taking, that whole story and putting it into motion picture. And just you can really appreciate the grand scale of how enormous the people of Israel were and what Moses was called to do. So for me, it's just a very nostalgic book, because for me, I can say that I think that was the first time I had ever seen a book of the Bible put to a movie, and it was part of our tradition. Growing up, my dad always wanted to watch the Ten Commandments when it would come on that Saturday night, the weekend before Easter. So that was like our little annual tradition, and I still, I watch it every year, either on hard copy or when it's airing on TV. So really a favorite book of mine. So I was pulling highlights out of chapter 3. I think just really honing in on the idea of success and being called to great responsibility. One of the greatest differences between the world's message of success or about success and what God has to say about it, I think, is this. The world seeks a single formula or path to produce a set of results for all people. And I think God's plan is usually far more personal than that. Moses didn't have a vision for success early in his life, although, of course, he was adopted, by Pharaoh and enjoyed a certain degree of privilege because of that. But he ended up murdering an Egyptian, and he ran for his life and then spent 40 years, tending sheep. But one day the Lord revealed himself to Moses and gave him a specific life mission. And so I think many of us go through difficult and even devastating experiences, and then one day we might come face to face with the reality of God. And is this the pattern that God seems to be implementing in our lives? If so, I think we have to remember to stick with the plan, regardless of how unorthodox it might seem. The promised land lies in that direction if we'll just go with it. What we can do what can we do to earn more spiritually responsible roles as believers? I think up to this point, few men ever had a greater responsibility placed on their shoulders than Moses. Of course, God tasked him with leading a nation of Israel out of the Egyptian bondage and into the promised land. These responsibilities require a spirit of faithfulness, dependability, and a refusal to give up when times get rough. I think Moses had these qualities, and God chose him as a special human representative. However, it did take quite a number of years to prepare Moses for such an enormous job that was awaiting him. He began his life as an impetuous and hot-headed and stubborn young man. When he witnessed the suffering of God's people in Egypt, immediately he sought to deliver them through his own strength, and neither he or the people benefited from that hasty action. God always clarifies our responsibilities so we can then respond in a form of obedience. He never leaves us alone, and he promises to shoulder those responsibilities with us. If he didn't, we would become so easily discouraged and really would just fail to understand the significance of our calling. So God's using various events and circumstances to prepare us for, I think, increased levels of spiritual responsibility. He used a burning bush to gain Moses' attention. This was the man's moment of calling. By this time, Moses' heart had become receptive, and his spirit was primed for a greater responsibility to come. So God is always equipping us for these responsibilities. He gives us, he provided Aaron as a friend, as a spokesman for Moses. Even the staff God gave Moses was amazingly useful as a symbol of his power. And of course, I think about, the parting of the water scene in the Ten Commandments here. God is always preparing us for the responsibility he assigns us. Anytime there is a calling for us to fulfill a certain task, we are going to likely enter a period of waiting. Moses tried to take a shortcut, and it backfired, and it cost them 40 years in the desert as a result. Yet in these times of waiting, God is molding and shaping us. And so the only way, I think, to meet the challenge of responsibility is to be willing to wait on God's timing in all situations. And 3 words sort of came to mind in this chapter, and that's confidence, of course, in what God is calling you to do. I think courage comes to mind because we have to have the courage to obey no matter what the cost might be and how long it might take, and commitment, ultimately, and of course to Jesus Christ. So I think these all characterize a responsible person, and God will give us limitless opportunities, but we just must assume the responsibility and obey the call.
You bring up such an excellent point there. That, I think so many times we don't necessarily think about is we think about, Moses' younger days there in Egypt and kind of the impetuousness and everything and murdering the Egyptian. And then we obviously think about like his calling and the latter part of his life where he's leading the people of Israel. But numbers are especially significant in the book of Exodus as they are in most of the Bible. But the number 40 is just repeated over and over and over again throughout Moses' life. We see that after he comes out of Egypt, he spends 40 years there in Midian. And I think you're right. I think during that 40 years, we see Moses growing a lot. I don't think the Moses that we get at the burning bush is the same Moses that we got that fled from Egypt all those years earlier. And we're going to see that number 40 over and over again. When Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, he's up there with God for 40 days and 40 nights. We're going to see it later on, like you mentioned, with the 40 years in the wilderness with the Israelites wandering. So 40 is typically... The number 40 is typically synonymous with some form of testing. We see that even in the New Testament, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40, fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And so I do think there's something there that God is working in Moses' life, and he's working to bring about that change and that transformation. And yeah, I think that's good. That's good. All right, Miss Michaela?
Something that really stuck out to me, I believe it was chapter 14, when Pharaoh's heart hardens. It says that God told Moses where to take the Israelites, and that part of where he wanted them to go was right in the path that Pharaoh was going to go in. And Moses knew that that's where Pharaoh was going to go, and he took them anyway in obedience to God. And when the Israelites leave Egypt, they go willingly, and then when they realize that Pharaoh is coming for them, they kind of turn on Moses. And it just kind of reminded me of how, like, when everything's going good and they were getting freed from slavery, they were all in, but then it got hard and they got scared and they weren't so sure about it anymore. But when they were super excited and when they were super scared and nervous, God didn't change. He stayed right there. So that is what stuck out to me the most.
Man, yeah. That was one of the things that I don't know if I'd ever really noticed. Like, I knew the story of, Moses parting the Red Sea and Pharaoh and the armies fleeing from him. And I'd even taught recently on, kind of the people coming to Moses, panicking, asking for direction. What I had not necessarily read and noticed before is that God had already revealed to Moses what his plan was. That God had already kind of told Moses, hey, I'm going to lead you to the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's going to pursue you, and I'm going to deliver you from there. And so it's one of the reasons why, because one of the things that's just amazing in that scene is how calm Moses is amidst everybody else kind of losing their mind. Like, everybody else is going like, why have you let us out here to die? And Moses is just like his instructions there. He gives them 3 basic instructions. Fear not, stand firm, watch and see the salvation of the Lord. I mean, like one, that's just amazing that here you have this, one of the most powerful armies in the world breathing down your necks, coming to just wipe you out and destroy you. And at that moment, he has enough faith, partly because I think God has already revealed to him what he's going to do, that he can say, don't be afraid, stand firm, watch what God's going to do. Man, what a great reminder for all of us there. So my verse this week, my insight this week came from chapter 13, and it's actually going to kind of parallel pretty closely with what Michaela was saying there, even. And a lot of it is, one of the things that amazes me is that not only does God deliver his people, because God could have delivered his people in any number of ways. I mean, we already see that God has a certain level of control even over the heart of Pharaoh. It talks about how Pharaoh hardened his heart, and eventually it starts saying that God had hardened his heart. So obviously God could have just simply moved the heart of Pharaoh, much the way he moves the heart of Caesar in the New Testament to take a census. He could have just moved Pharaoh's heart and said, hey, let my people go. But he doesn't do that. He delivers his people in such a way through these miraculous means, partly because he wants them to have a story to pass down, and he wants them to have something to remember, something that as they look back on these things, as they think back on these things, they're left with this just incredible picture of who their God is. And we see that not only does he do these miraculous acts, but that he then initiates and institutes certain actions and certain like festivals and reminders and things like that for the purpose of remembering what he's done. So like, you have that scene where, the death angel comes through and is wiping out all the firstborns across the land, but the Israelites are told to paint the blood of the lamb over their doorposts and on the side of their doorposts. And each year, not only is this just a beautiful representation and a foreshadowing of Christ, especially when you start realizing the timing and the symbolism and everything that was at Passover, that the ultimate Passover lamb, Christ, is going to shed his blood and be sacrificed so that we can be forgiven of our sins and not face death. So there's just this incredible picture and this incredible thing that God's doing there. But he does this, and then he tells them, hey, every year you're going to celebrate this event, this Passover, and you're going to do it in a specific way so that you remember. You remember what I've done for you here. And not only so that you remember, and here's, I think, the real big thing, so that your children, even the ones who didn't live through it, can ask you, hey, what does this mean? And you can say, this is what God has done for us. This is what God did for us in the past. And he does that repeatedly. And we see there in verse 13 that he's instituting these festivals. Not only does he institute the Feast of Passover, but the event of Passover, but he then follows it up with a 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. I mean, like, hey, this is a pretty cool God, right? I mean, not only does he do great things, but he also says, hey, celebrate it and feast over it. So that's pretty neat. But he says, as you're celebrating this and taking part in these feasts and these festivals, remember what I've done for you. Every year when you take part in this feast and you eat of this bread and you remember what I've done. And he does this. And he institutes several things. He also here, he tells them they're to consecrate the firstborn so that every time, whether it's an animal or a person has a firstborn child, there was to be this sacrifice that was given. So whenever like a firstborn child was born, they would sacrifice a lamb to redeem that child back from God. And so there's this picture of, even in that action that's built in, these milestones, these lifetime milestones that are built into their existence, God is reminding them, well, why do we do that? Why do we sacrifice a lamb for the firstborn? Because God redeemed us and delivered us out of Egypt by killing the firstborn. And so he just builds these different reminders into their lives, and I believe he builds these same types of reminders into our lives as well. But the question is why? Why does God do that? And I think there's two primary reasons why God does that. I think God knows two important things about us, and this kind of goes right along with what Michaela was saying. One, I think he understands and he knows here that when things go well, it is easy for us to forget God. When everything is flowing well, when everything is working out the way that we want it to, it's very easy for us to just lose sight of the bigger picture of who God is and what God's done for us. And that's really what, like, we see that later on. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Because Deuteronomy chapter 6 is the people of Israel standing on the edge of the promised land. They're getting ready to go in and take it. Moses, their leader, can't go with them. And so he's giving them kind of final instructions. And this is the warning that he gives them, is that you're about to go in and take a land that you didn't have to do, that God's just going to hand to you. That you're not going to have to build the buildings, you're not going to have to dig the wells. And he tells them there in Deuteronomy 6, verse 10, that when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So there's this reminder that when things are going well, God knows we are prone to forget what God has done for us. And so he wants them to remember. He wants them to remember in the days ahead when they're experiencing God's blessing, don't forget the God who gives that blessing. Because we all do that. I think, especially in America, we're especially susceptible of this. We've been so richly blessed in comparison to other countries and other places with all these different things, but sometimes it's easy for us to start worshiping the gift and the things that God gives us more so than the Creator who gave it to us in the first place. So God knows this. He knows that when things are going well, it's easy for us to forget. But He also knows this, that when things are going poorly, it's easy for us to doubt God. And this is going to really be the kind of the narrative of the people of Israel for the next 40 plus 50 years at this point. Because it just seems like over and over and over again, God's going to lead them, God's going to do miraculous things. But the first sign of opposition, they're going to start thinking back to, oh, things were so much better in Egypt. I mean, and this is like the narrative, like over and over and over again. It's like here, they're there on the edge of the Red Sea. God's just done these miraculous signs to lead them out of Egypt, and they see the armies approaching. And immediately they're going, "What have you done for us? Why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Things weren't really that bad there." And then He's going to get them to the other side, and they're going to be short of water there at Marah, and they're going to go, "Why didn't you just leave us there? At least we weren't going to die in the desert." And then they're going to go a little bit further. They're going to get hungry, and they're going to go, "Oh, why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? At least there we had leeks and onions and had all this thing." And it's just this constant state of kind of complaining, and over and over again, God's going to deliver them through miraculous ways. He not only delivers them through the 10 plagues on Egypt, but He's going to part the Red Sea. He's going to feed them with manna and quail from heaven. He's going to lead them with a pillar of fire by day and or cloud by day and fire by night. He's going to, give them directly His law there on Mount Sinai and speak to them. And He does all of these things. He doesn't. I think the main reason that He's doing things in this way is because just what He says here. He wants to give them something to pass down. And so much of the festivals and the reminders and the remembrances that they are given by God is for that person. Or for that purpose, so that they will not forget all that God has done for them. Whether in good times and things going good, we just lose sight of Him, or whether it's in the bad times, we begin to doubt His goodness. Each year they had these built-in reminders of don't forget what your good God has done for you. I think that's good. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us this week. You guys got anything else? Y'all good?
To be continued.
To be continued. That's right. We're continuing our way through the book of Exodus. I think we should hopefully finish up the book of Exodus sometime in this next week or so. But we're excited about taking this journey with you. Stay firm. Whatever plan you're doing. If you're doing the straight through the Bible plan like we are, or the chronological plan, or whether you're just doing the 2-week plan, where you look at different verses over a 2-week period that kind of follow a theme. Hey, the main thing that we're excited about is that you're in the Word. So stay strong, continue in that journey, and we'll see you next time.